Let's turn to Romans 14, Unplugged, Feast and Fast and Food, oh my. And last week we didn't really look at the study. Instead, last week we did what I called a promo show, where I simply talked about the study as an overview and gave you kind of a catch-up as to what the study has entailed. But now, picking up from where we left off 2 weeks ago, let's pick up the study in this paragraph where we finished talking about, we're in the conclusions to this first part of Romans 14, where we're just kind of introducing the idea, the scope of the study, and asking the question, who are the weak in faith? And so we'll continue down through the conclusion. We won't finish it tonight, but just so you know, 14.2, or the next section, is the question is asked, what is the contrast between anything and vegetables? So we'll start looking at verse number 2. But we're still basically in verse 1. And last week, we had this quote from Tim Hegg. Let me just read... okay, there we go. This was where I left off 2 weeks ago. So let me create a segue between the two studies. I'm going to read this real quick. I'm not going to stop and elaborate. It's self-explanatory. And then we'll pick up the study tonight, technically right there. So starting right here, this is what we studied 2 weeks ago. This is my own words. Indeed, if according to traditional Gentile Christianity, Paul abandoned his Torah-keeping stance in favor of becoming all things to all men, recall 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23, a position that, in my opinion, as a Messianic Jewish believer in Yeshua, suspiciously seems to always default back into some semblance of a Torahless, non-Jewish form of Gentile Christianity, then it naturally follows that he would not wish to have strong Christian community members at Rome, be they Jewish or Gentile, retaining any loyalty to ceremonial aspects of the ostensibly canceled law of Moses. This is just kind of standard Christian theology that I'm highlighting here, that for the last 2,000 years, it's no secret that the traditional Christian Gentile portion of remnant Israel, what we call the Christian church, for the most part, I know there are exceptions in some areas, but for the most part, standard Christian theology teaches that the law has been relaxed in Jesus. It's been set aside by the death of Messiah. It's been fulfilled by the works that Jesus did. And therefore, because Yeshua was perfectly obedient to the law of Moses, then we no longer have to obligate ourselves to do it. Indeed, various passages out of the letters that Paul wrote, phrases like under the law, works of the law, things like that, the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Different passages are interpreted to mean that the law is done away with, it's been set aside, at least the ceremonial parts of it, and that we as Gentile Christians no longer have to worry about such things. But I go on to say, in such a scenario, such law-keeping Jews and Gentiles must be weak in faith, that is, this is traditional Christian perspective. They must be weak in faith as evidenced by their continuing dependency upon shadows. Remember, the law is a shadow, and I'm not mocking that. That's actually accurate. That theology is true. The law is a shadow, and Yeshua is the body, or what we call the type, if we're using the analogy of type and shadow. The law, the Torah, is a shadow, and Yeshua is the body. He's the type. He's the substance of which the law is the shadow that's being cast behind him. And so when Christians around the world are found to be following after the law of Moses, this of course would include many Messianic Jews, but also now these days includes many Messianic Gentiles, then they are considered by many Christians to be following after shadows. So if you're following after shadows instead of relying fully upon the finished work of Messiah, the body who's casting those shadows in the first place, then most Christians are going to consider that if you're a Torah keeper, that your theology is either weak. In other words, you're either a weak Christian and that's why you're still following after Torah, or perhaps you're a legalist. These are just general Christian sentiments that show up in churches around the world regarding people who keep Torah. And I'm making very broad generalizations. I'm not trying to stereotype non-Torah keeping Christians or something like that, or Torah keeping Christians. I'm simply speaking in broad generalities, at least from my own personal experience of having interacted and visiting churches and Messianic congregations and synagogues, at least around America and now over here in Korea. So this is just a general observation. So that's what we looked at 2 weeks ago. This is still within our conclusion Conclusions. And the reason this is becoming relevant for us is because when we ask this first question in our study, who are the weak in faith, of Romans 14:1, the traditional Christian perspective is that the weak Christians are those, they're weak Christians whose weakness is directly connected to their belief in Jesus, plus a continued dependency upon Torah. And as we keep mentioning, the weak are expected by the strong in the letter. This is traditional Christian perspective. The weak are expected to gradually grow in their faith and eventually leave the ceremonial parts of Torah behind. So that's why we're looking at that. Of course, you guys already know that the alternative perspective is something that I champion instead, and we'll look at that later on. But let's keep reading down through my commentary, starting now tonight here. Let's pick up our reading here. I have to say, we also found that by going back to the original context of Paul's letter and searching within passages where he already utilized weak and strong language, right? This is the best practices when you're studying through the Torah, is start from the internal evidence to understand what it is you're reading. So you come across a passage where you have phrases that are unfamiliar to you, weak and strong, under the law, works of the law, things like that. And you start scratching your head and thinking, what do these terms mean? And you're inclined to just kind of assume, well, I think that means this based on my familiarity with Bible passages. But what you should do, at least maybe one suggestion, at least something I do, is start searching through the context of the immediate book, surrounding chapters, surrounding verses, surrounding chapter, and start working your way out in kind of a zoom out feature, like if you've ever used Google Maps or something like that. Start zooming out to start looking for verbiage that'll clue you into the context of the special language that the writer's using. And so that's what I tried to do. So what we found by going back to the original context of Paul's letter, right? So within the context of the letter itself, remember Romans 14 is one chapter within a larger letter. Then what we're able to better connect to when we're looking at weak and strong language is the context of the earlier parts of his letter to the overall audience in Rome and the latter parts of the letter. We can't lose sight of the fact that it's the same audience, it's the same writer, and it's the same letter. At least we have the assumption as one letter. It could have been multiple pieces of papyrus or parchment or whatever he was writing on, but nevertheless it's considered one letter by today's standards. So we can assume that it was one letter. Maybe it was broken up into several pieces, but it was one letter to the recipients of Rome. And so now we can treat that as one giant context. So we work our way from Romans 14, we go backwards into the letter and begin to look for clues as to what these phrases mean. Thus, as I mentioned, Nanos once again remind us, and we're talking about Mark Nanos. He's the one that put together the study. You're seeing a little graphic on your screen right now, a picture of Mark Nanos, the author, and that I put in post-production. You people in live class, you're not seeing it right now. I'm talking to my YouTube audience. And you can see the book here that I've got on the screen, The Mystery of Romans, with the black cover there and the red writing. That's the book that kind of started this whole firestorm of who are the weak in faith and championing this idea that they're not weak Christians, that they're something else instead. And so here's what Mark Nanos is going to propose, and I think it has a very strong case that is being made here. Mark Nanos says the strong/able in this letter are Christians, right? And that part is agreed across both sides of the table, both sides of the discussion, both traditional Christians as well as people like Mark Nanos who take a different position, like myself. We both agree that the strong in Paul's letter are Christians. In fact, Paul identifies himself among the strong in chapter 15. So we can make that designation. Nanos continues, they, speaking of the strong, include Jews like Paul and a small group of Christian Jews in Rome, and Gentiles like the majority of the audience he is addressing in Rome, that follow in the footsteps or follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, and we can read about that in chapter 4, verse 12 of Romans. So notice right away that Nanos is alerting us to the fact that the context of weak and strong for Paul began with Abraham. And the connection is that in that they believe, right, like Abraham, the strong / able believe, that is, they are able and are strengthened to recognize that Jesus, by his resurrection from the dead, has been demonstrated to be the promised seed, the Christ of Israel, and the Savior of the world. And you can recall Romans chapter 1, verse 4 and verse 16, as well as Romans 3, 21 through 26. Speaking of these strong, they too had been weak before believing in Christ, right? Now look at this verse. This is very interesting. Paul says in Romans 5:6, quote, "For while we were still helpless," and the Greek is asthenon, while we were still helpless or weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. Again, Romans 5:6. What's really interesting is that this Greek word asthenon is a similar form of the Greek word used to describe the phrase weak in faith. It's the exact same root word in the Greek, and therefore Paul, I believe, is making a connection between this concept of weak / stumbling or unable, as in not strong, and this idea that Abraham was not weak in faith, but we were at one time weak, and we were weak in faith, and we were helpless, and at the right time, at that time, then Christ died for us. So that's an interesting contextual clue as to figuring out what Paul means in this part of his letter. Nanos continues, "Thus it is to the strong that Paul directs most, perhaps all, of his instructions throughout chapters 12 through 15, what most authors call the paraenesis, or the heavily exhortative part of his letter, where he's exhorting us. Paul's telling us with his passionate plea to live a certain way. Now that you have this theology that I've just introduced you for the first part of my letter, starting in chapter 12, moving through chapter 15, I'm going to exhort you to behave this way, to make sure that you're living your lifestyle in accordance with this body of instructions and truth and this reality of who you are in Messiah. This is what we call the paraenesis of Paul's letter. So it's this part of his letter that Paul is addressing the strong. For while they are able, right? This word "able" there is related to this phrase "strong," right, in the Greek. While they're able to hold up those in the process of stumbling, right, the weak, the stumbling, as these strong exercise their gifts and respect what is right in the sight of men, they are, however, also able, right? Again, the able word is a key word that alerts us that they are strong. They are also able, watch this, the strong are able to throw down the stone that will destroy the weak. So we who are strong, we bear this responsibility to be careful in the way that we behave amongst the weak in faith. So really the question once again is, who are the weak in faith? Let me just tell you, this quote from Mark Nanos was lifted from, you can see my little footnote here, number 20. Mark Nanos, The Mystery of Romans, that's that book I showed you earlier. The Jewish Context of Paul's Letters, that's Fortress Press 1996, and that was lifted from page 144. All right, we've got about 7 more minutes in this part of my study. Let's continue reading maybe 1 or 2 more paragraphs, maybe at least 1. All right, I go on to say in my own commentary, we're still in Romans chapter 14's commentary here. In the end, these are my thoughts. Instead of resting the context of Paul's letter in this important section away from the letter as a whole, right, which is, I'm sad to say, but I think the majority, the popular position within Christian circles today has, unfortunately, not in all parts, but in many important parts, taken the context of Paul's letter out of context and created their own context, a subtext. In that we believe, when we say that the weak in faith are Christians, we begin to set up this scenario where the weak in faith are identified or characterized by their continued preference for keeping Torah, which connects them to their label weak in faith. And the only conclusion that we can come to as strong Christians is that we would interpret Paul's admonition that the weak should eventually grow up, become strong in faith, and in their growth as Christians, they would naturally abandon their preferences for keeping the ceremonial parts of Torah. And in my opinion, that departs from the context of Paul's letter. So that's what I'm trying to say in this part of my commentary. So if we depart from the context, let me start there again. In the end, instead of wresting the context of Paul's letter in this important section away from the letter as a whole, we can instead, right, this is my challenge to us as Bible students, if we can instead begin to encounter in today's modern commentaries to this chapter in Romans a perspective that makes a break from the popular yet ill-suited theology that pits Paul against the Judaism that he formerly practiced as a non-Christian Jew. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that the current research, particularly I'm highlighting Mark Nanos, but there are other authors who've done the same type of research and have come to similar conclusions as Mark Nanos. He's not the only one. He's just one of the more vocal ones that you're going to find in bookstores today if you go searching after this particular topic. I think it's worth researching. I know I'm probably not going to convince many of you who are following my commentary or just watching this YouTube video. This is the first time you've heard such a perspective that the weak in faith are not Christians, but they're instead unbelieving or non-Christian Jews. If you've ever heard this perspective, if you've never heard this perspective, then you're probably going to reject it outright because it just doesn't fit with the theology and the narrative that you've been handed in your traditional Christian church setting. But I'm trying to challenge you to take a second look, and you owe it to your own biblical research as a Berean to ask yourself if Paul would actually champion a law-free gospel, a perspective where he's teaching Gentiles that they no longer have to keep the Torah, and eventually also teaching Jews in Messiah that they too have no formal or legal obligation to follow after the words that God gave to Israel 1,500 years earlier than Paul's writings. So we got now 3,500 years of Israel's history of Torah giving, of receiving the words of Torah at Sinai. Would Paul actually be under the assumption and have the authority in the communities of his day? Would the Judaisms of his day actually accept this perspective? Would they allow him to talk that way? And by today's standards, as far as we can tell, this is not the Paul of the New Testament, a Paul that championed a law-free gospel. We need to rethink Paul's theology. I go on to say in my commentary, it is in this vein that a better and more balanced view of Paul and his addressees emerges, usually in the form of commentaries put out by those in the emerging Torah/Messianic movement. So that's all I'm really trying to challenge us with. I'll stop right there in my commentary tonight. You owe it to yourself as a well-meaning Bible student to pick up commentaries like the one I'm purporting. Again, Mark Nanos is not the only one. I myself have this position. Mark Nanos, of course, is the one that influenced me. Tim Hague holds this position. J.K. McKee of Messianic Apologetics holds a similar position. At least I'm pretty sure he does. I'll have to go back and double check on that. But there are other authors that I know in the Messianic movement and in Christian circles that are steadily coming over. We already looked at another one earlier in my commentary, Pastor Elliott, that held to a similar position. So yes, we are a minority who are saying that the weak in faith are not Christians. And even if I'm wrong, I'm still going to, even if I'm wrong that the weak in faith are not Christians, I'm still going to continue holding to a view that Paul did not teach a law-free gospel, that Paul did not relax his stance on Torah keeping, that Paul was a lifelong Jew, Torah-keeping Jew, a lifelong loyal Jew, and that he himself not only upheld a Torah-keeping lifestyle, but that he also would strongly encourage Gentiles, if they had the ability and the privilege, to be able to walk into Torah keeping just like he as a Messianic Jew did. Okay? Amen? Amen.